I knew something was wrong the second I walked into the leadership huddle and Vanya's eyes grazed over me like I was a damn paperclip in her inbox. Necessary, but disposable. She didn't know my name. She didn't ask. She just said, "We'll sunset the old systems fast," like I was drywall waiting to be demoed. And everyone else? They just nodded, smiling, like they'd already priced my headstone and moved on. 12 years. That's how long I carried that company like a spinal brace. My title, Business Systems Director, didn't cover half of it. I built the protocols that kept our global warehouse network from collapsing under its own weight, designed the routing logic that shaved millions off shipping delays, signed off on every damn API integration, licensing handshake, and trust certificate. I didn't showboat, didn't schmooze at investor dinners, but when something broke in Osaka or Rotterdam, my phone rang. Not Vanya's, not the CTO's, mine. And when Marshall, the founder, the guy who actually read the architecture reports, stepped down, Vanya swept in with a synthetic smile, a portfolio of influencer photos, and a Harvard MBA she flashed like a fake badge at a crime scene. Her PowerPoint said, "Recalibrate, replatform, reimagine." My gut said, "Run." She brought her own team, a baby CTO from some failing startup and an EA who called herself a time architect. Jesus. Listen, before we go further, if you're even thinking about skipping the rest of this story, hit the subscribe button and like the video. Only 3% of folks ever do, but it really helps the team keep telling the stories that execs pray never get leaked. Anyway, Vanya didn't ask questions, just assumed everything ran on Magic and Gmail. She wanted to wipe the system clean like we were some freshman dorm project, not a live network routing goods across 5 continents. What she didn't know, what no one asked, was that the heart of our system, a little predictive load balancer called Mappin Core, wasn't owned by Norellian, not directly. Years ago, I'd advised Marshall to wrap the core algorithms into a custodial trust, Delaware LLC, hardwired with access safeguards and certificate locks. Why? Because we'd been burned once, early on. A board member tried to license our logic to a third-party distributor behind Marshall's back. After that, Marshall asked me how to protect the crown jewels. I built a vault, made myself trustee, and buried the key under compliance protocols only I could verify. It wasn't ego, it was security. And now, that vault still existed. The registrar still pointed to me. The license chain, Mappin's spine, ran straight through a digital escrow where my name was stamped in black ink. Vanya thought I was a holdover, a relic. The legacy junk drawer you clean out before the IPO roadshow. What she didn't realize is I wasn't legacy, I was leverage. And the moment she smiled at me like she'd already written my termination date in her planner, I started counting down. They called it a strategic pivot, but it felt more like being pushed out of a moving truck while they smiled and waved from the cab. First week, my internal roles started shifting. The systems I used to monitor from end to end, suddenly I was locked out of the registry interface, then the analytics dashboard, then version control, one by one, access denied. They didn't revoke it all at once. No, that would have looked hostile. This was death by permissions. The new CTO showed up like some hyper-caffeinated grad student with a god complex. Hadn't even unpacked his office before he started dropping phrases like agile modularity and elastic CI/CD scaffolds. I asked him once, what governance layer he was planning to use for warehouse rollouts, and he blinked at me like I'd asked him to recite the periodic table in reverse. He wore white sneakers with a navy suit and had a background in social metrics. I looked him up later. His last startup was a gamified loyalty app for frozen yogurt shops. That was the guy rewriting our routing backbone. Procurement stopped copying me on renewal schedules. My signature was suddenly not required. Engineers I'd walked through their first build cycles wouldn't look me in the eye. Vanya's assistant, she had one of those names that sounded like a furniture brand, Calera or something, started gatekeeping my calendar invites, citing executive bandwidth constraints. HR reached out to schedule a collaboration dynamics refresher, whatever the hell that means. And through it all, I stayed quiet, watched, logged everything. Because I knew what they didn't, Mappin Core, the thing that made Norellian valuable, the algorithm that took 11 warehouses worth of chaos and turned it into near-perfect routing logic. That asset wasn't in the code base anymore, not legally, not structurally. It was held in a layered custodial framework I helped write after the 2016 licensing scare. It had its own key structure, its own certificate pathway, and a private registrar bound to a trust agreement with 3 signatures, one of which was mine. irrevocable unless I died or chose otherwise. And no one had ever asked me about it, not once. They thought they were phasing me out, trimming fat, upgrading to some sleeker, cloud-native thing with pretty dashboards and zero legacy. But they weren't upgrading. They were slowly disconnecting themselves from the only architecture that actually worked. Every tool Vanya was canceling had one silent dependency: MapPin. Her vertical future was balanced on a system she hadn't even identified. It was like watching someone tear out the walls of their house because the paint was dated, completely unaware they were holding up the damn roof. I documented every tool they decommissioned, every platform they switched, every time they bypassed my signature. Because when the lights started flickering, and they would, I wanted the ledger clean. They thought the shift was theirs to make. They never imagined I was already halfway through making mine. The moment I saw that red flag calendar invite, no subject, no agenda, just mandatory attendance, I knew. There's a particular flavor of corporate dread that sets in when a company doesn't even bother to lie to you gently. No leadership alignment, no vision refresh, just a blank screen and silence. I wore black that day, not for drama, for closure. At 3:07 p.m., right on the dot, Vanya flickered onto the screen like the villain reveal in a tech soap opera. Perfect lighting, a studio mic, that fake-ass TED Talk cadence like she was about to sell us a mindfulness app instead of body bags. "I believe in clean slates," she began, smile locked in place like Botox meets ambition. "And today, we're starting fresh." She didn't even blink. Effective immediately, we are parting ways with several legacy contributors who no longer fit the future of Norellian. Then, like a hostess announcing specials at a steakhouse, she added, "Jason Fell is among them." Jason was our back-end architect. He built the load distribution matrix that MapPin still leaned on for fallback. Brilliant, quiet, never missed a review cycle. His name popped up and vanished in the same breath, like a sacrificial offering to the altar of disruption. That's when I knew I was next. Not just next, already done. I didn't need to wait for the dagger. I was the opening act, so I didn't say a word. Didn't argue. I just reached beside me, picked up my badge, and held it up to the webcam. Let it hang there for a second so they could all see it. Then placed it on my desk, centered like an artifact, and stood up. No dramatic monologue, no parting shots, just silence. And the sound of a chair sliding back. I left the frame. By 3:20 p.m., my Slack access was gone. GitHub account revoked. Confluence login deactivated. The system scrub was fast, I'll give them that. Like I'd never existed, except I had. And not just in the admin console or the credentials archive. I still existed in the root ledger. See, the thing about building something critical is that the most important pieces aren't in the places people look. They're under the floorboards, wrapped in redundancy, air-gapped, and bound by logic few executives even know exists. I didn't need to hold on to my corporate credentials because the infrastructure still held on to mine. The registrar for the MapPin licensing handshake still pointed to my private LLC, the blockchain timestamp on the last certificate rotation, still showed my node signature. The API dependency map, half of it didn't even route without trust validation from an escrow token I generated on a machine Vanya didn't even know existed. So sure, they could wipe me from HR, paint me out of the org chart, cut me from payroll, but they couldn't delete what they didn't understand. They fired me from the company, but not from the foundation it still stood on. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't even turn the ignition toward home. Instead, I took the ramp off I-25 like muscle memory, down to the edge of the industrial park Norellian had long since outgrown. The storage facility still had my name on one of the units. Well, a name. The one tied to the secondary entity Marshall and I created back when we were young and paranoid enough to think redundancy was a compliment. Unit B14, unassuming, windowless, cement walls that didn't care about layoffs or LinkedIn influencers. I opened the keypad box, still marked NOAR MD Escrow Services, and punched in the old code. Inside was my rig. Not pretty, not portable, but armored like a tank. Battery backups, air-gapped cores, no Wi-Fi in or out unless I plugged it with my own hands. Some people build doomsday bunkers. I built one in code, booted it up. Authenticated through 3 layers: token, biometric, key phrase. Then I accessed the ledger. MapPin Core had been humming quietly in production for 8 years. Every warehouse optimization packet, every load time prediction, every overflow prevention warning, that all flowed through its arteries. It wasn't a product, it was the nervous system. And while they'd migrated the UI, rerouted dashboards, and sunset old monitoring tools, the heartbeat was still mine. I ran the script. Not a worm, not ransomware, nothing malicious. Just a clean, notarized reassignment. Root registrar shifted back to the trust. Core license keys revoked and regenerated, tokenized with escrow-flagged authentication. Certificate authorities rolled over with new signers. Every heartbeat of the system that depended on that core framework now pinged a door I'd just quietly closed. It didn't crash, didn't throw an error. Map-pin core just went quiet, like a pianist lifting their fingers off the keys mid-performance. The silence louder than a siren, not deleted, not broken, just asleep. Because if you never transfer ownership and then you fire the only custodian, what you're left with isn't theft. It's gravity. The moment I shut the lid on that rig, I felt it. Not relief, not triumph, just the weight shifting back to where it belonged. Norellian's leadership thought the system was theirs, but it had always been mine to steady, mine to sign, mine to maintain. And now it simply stopped holding them up. Their foundation didn't collapse. It just let go. At 4:12 p.m., the first alert pinged. A Fortune 100 client out of Chicago. Their overnight distribution center flagged the core routing API as invalid. License key rejected. Most of the time that meant a sync issue, a cache hiccup, something small, except this time the request didn't bounce. It died. No fallback, no degraded mode, just silence. At 4:17 p.m., another alert. This one internal. Warehouse dashboards along the western corridor, Boise, Albuquerque, Temecula flashed red. Not a server crash, a permissions failure. Their routing engines couldn't access the predicted load tables, which meant every automated dispatch would have to go manual, which meant delays, which meant missed windows. At 4:23 p.m., the CTO got on the internal call, smug and clueless as ever, and said, "Must be a cert expiration. We'll roll it forward." A junior engineer, Greg, I think, someone I mentored through his first integration sprint, muted and unmuted 3 times before finally speaking. "Sir, none of the certs are set to expire for another 113 days. I checked the chain myself." The CTO's face twitched. Then he pivoted into jargon, maybe a handshake bug, but it was already clear he was guessing. Then came the cascade. Attempts to access the root registrar failed. DevOps tried to initiate a DNS refresh and got locked out. Legal tried to verify license ownership against the last update file, only to find the file path now pointed to a defunct subdomain. The Zoom call itself froze for a handful of users. Azure flagged 3 simultaneous authentication anomalies originating from IPs in different states. MFA failed for one of the senior engineers. By 4:47 p.m., they were in a panic. At 4:53 p.m., an executive assistant reached out to the client liaison team to prepare a press holding statement. It never went out, because at 5:00 p.m., the automated client portal triggered its final failover protocol. Top 5 clients, tens of millions in ARR, received an identical message. Operational disruption under review. Please stand by for license reassignment clarification. That phrasing wasn't accidental. I wrote it. The thing is, every system at Norellian had a map. Every escalation had a diagram, every resource had an owner. But this vault, the one tied to the custodial trust, was never mapped in the internal wiki. It was off-registry, off-index. Its existence wasn't even noted on the IT-escalation tree because Marshall and I built it to not exist unless it needed to. And now it needed to. They spun up recovery rooms, war rooms, RACI charts, calls to outside consultants. But it didn't matter because they were searching for a door with no hinges, a system with no login page, a foundation they didn't even know was beneath their feet. They thought they could push the old guard out and run the future on vibes and jargon, but they never asked the most dangerous question in operations: who holds the keys? And now, they were locked outside a house they didn't even know they'd been renting. The emergency operations call felt like watching a live autopsy, except the body on the table was still twitching, and no one wanted to admit who'd held the scalpel. It was 9:41 p.m. Denver time. Everyone looked wrecked, sleeves rolled, ties undone, glossy foreheads from hours of pacing and blaming and Googling phrases like custodial license recovery protocol, like that was something you could just download and run. Vanya had gone full executive crisis mode, hair down, glasses on, playing the role of concerned but competent. She kept repeating words like alignment and business continuity, like they were spells that might undo the fact that millions of dollars in active logistics routing had frozen like a digital stroke. The CTO, whose name I still hadn't bothered to learn, was half whispering to someone off screen, clearly trying to get a last-minute lifeline from some junior dev who once sat near the old data staging scripts. Then Dana leaned in. Dana from compliance. The last original thread from Marshall's founding team. She'd been quiet all night, watching, listening. That kind of stillness you only get from people who know the rules because they wrote half of them. "I have a question," she said, voice as flat and calm as a sunrise after a storm. The room stilled. Even Vanya stopped mid-sentence. Dana kept her gaze locked on the screen like she wasn't asking, she was cross-examining. "Who currently holds the credentials to MapPin Core's trust chain?" No one answered. The CTO glanced sideways like maybe legal had the answer. Legal's block of screens all muted themselves at once, like cowards ducking behind procedural red tape. Vanya blinked, lips parting, but nothing came out. Dana didn't blink. Because if that asset is tied to an irrevocable custodial trust, and I believe it is, then unless a notarized transfer has been logged and filed, we don't own it. You could hear the oxygen leave the room. No denial, no outrage, just silence. She waited one beat longer, then added the sentence that finally cracked the surface of their delusion. "You need to call her." The pronoun landed like a sledgehammer. Not him. Her. Not the CTO, not legal, not Vanya, me. That's when it clicked for them. All of it. This wasn't sabotage. This wasn't a breach. No one had hacked anything. The trust wasn't broken. It had simply been activated by the very people who violated its terms. They fired the trustee. They voided the one handshake that mattered. The foundation didn't collapse. It was reclaimed. By someone who had never left the system, only stepped back far enough to let them bury themselves in ignorance. They didn't lose control of MapPin. They never had it to begin with. The first message came in at 10:22 p.m. from legal, from some junior associate whose voice cracked halfway through the voicemail. "We're hoping to clarify some asset concerns related to the MapPin stack. If you could, please call us back at your earliest." Click. No number left. No callback window. They already knew they were late. At 11:03 p.m., Vanya's name popped up in my inbox. Subject line, urgent discussion, legacy infrastructure. The body was 4 sentences of performative diplomacy, calling me a valued contributor to Norellian's growth, and asking to collaborate toward a swift and mutually beneficial resolution. I read it twice. Noticed she still didn't say my name. I closed the email, no reply. By midnight, the Whisper network inside the executive chain was hemorrhaging confusion. The merger team had sent over their due diligence package earlier that week. $270 million from Halstead Industries, contingent on verified ownership of all core IP and routing assets. Standard clause, standard risk check. What they didn't expect was Dana's disclosure. At 12:41 a.m., she filed it straight into the shared deal room. Core optimization system, MapPin Core, is currently held in an irrevocable custodial trust. Access and ownership not formally transferred to Norellian at time of last trustee dismissal. That single paragraph detonated the deal room. Halstead's counsel flagged the filing within the hour. They didn't panic, yet, but the language shifted fast. Asset exposure. Chain of title. Potential non-performance. I watched it all unfold from the log mirror I'd embedded into Norellian's audit interface 4 years ago. It was supposed to be for compliance testing, just a way to ensure record integrity across internal systems. I used it now like a silent confession booth, watching them scramble to document a history they never bothered to understand. At 2:38 a.m., a password reset attempt hit my secondary email. Their third one that night. The domain tag told me it came from a machine registered to their Azure admin node. They were trying to ghost themselves in through my old credentials, thinking maybe I hadn't wiped the hooks clean. I hadn't, because I hadn't needed to. There was nothing left to reset. nothing left to gain access to. Mappin Core wasn't broken, the system wasn't corrupted, no data was compromised, it just didn't belong to them anymore. Or maybe it never had. They built their castle on land they never owned, and now the deed had surfaced. Ownership wasn't revoked, it was revealed. Marshall's name lit up my phone at 6:12 a.m. I hadn't heard from him in nearly a year, not since his farewell party, where he handed out custom whiskey tumblers and told everyone to take care of the house. He hadn't meant the building, he'd meant the system, the soul of it. His voice was rough, but clear. Did you really hold on to the vault? I didn't hesitate. I held it until someone trustworthy arrived. He gave that same gravelly laugh he used to pull out when board meetings got too self-congratulatory. But this one ended short. Can it be transferred? Yes, I said, with consent. A pause. Not just yours? No, not anymore. At 7:03 a.m., Vanya's assistant sent over a draft agreement. The subject line was resolution path. The body read like it had been written by someone who'd been coached to sound collaborative but still couldn't quite hide the arrogance. It opened with legalese, danced into performance metrics, and concluded with a line that tried to sound gracious. We appreciate your past contributions and hope you'll support the transition for the good of the company, as if they were doing me a favor by inviting me back to clean up their mess. I didn't even redline it, just forwarded it back untouched with one sentence. Incorrect premise. I'm not your asset to negotiate. Then I forwarded the original custodial charter, time-stamped, signed, and notarized in 2017 to Halstead's legal team. Let the actual adults in the room take it from there. By 9 o'clock a.m., Halstead's GC had reviewed the entire framework. I could almost hear their pen tapping through the screen. They reached the critical line, buried halfway down page 6 under subsection 4.2.3. In the event of custodial reassignment, no transfer shall be enforceable following involuntary termination of the active trustee unless accompanied by formal release documentation, signed by said trustee and countersigned by founding entity or successor with full fiduciary standing. Translation: fire me and you don't get the keys. They couldn't bluff, couldn't override, couldn't substitute some junior admin with Azure tokens and call it good. It was ink and chain of custody. Real authority. Halstead paused everything. The deal, the briefing, the PR rollout. They scheduled a new call. Urgent, high priority, internal only. Legal, compliance, and Marshall. And me. Same time as the official acquisition call. I didn't need to rehearse. I didn't need to prepare a statement. There was no emotion left to drain. Just architecture. Just leverage. Vanya had tried to build a future by burning the past. Now, to get to that future, she'd have to walk through the ashes, barefoot. The screen loaded like a curtain rising. Clean background, polished logos, a row of anxious executives pretending their world hadn't just been turned upside down. Halstead's chair started with the usual pleasantries, but the tension in the room was thick enough to slice with a stylus. Everyone on the Norellian side looked like they'd spent the night sweating through silk sheets. Except for Vanya. She looked immaculate. Blazer crisp, hair swept into that tight LinkedIn bun she wore for big investor meetings. Expression composed like she still had cards to play. She greeted the chair like nothing had happened, like the house wasn't burning behind her. And now, the chair said, smiling thinly, let's introduce the custodial majority holder of Mappin Core per yesterday's legal confirmation. Then came the moment I clicked the camera on. No introduction, no grand entrance. Just me, sitting in front of a blank wall, with every receipt tucked behind my calm expression. Vanya didn't move at first, then her jaw twitched. No, she whispered, not even to anyone in particular, just the kind of reflex denial that leaks out when the scaffolding finally buckles. That's impossible. I nodded once. Good morning. She blinked, lips parting, searching for something to say, but there was nothing left in the script. No pivot, no recovery slide, just the stark, unwelcome realization that she was no longer in control, and maybe never had been. Across the screen, Dana didn't smile. She didn't need to. She just looked at me with that measured, steady gaze of someone who'd waited long enough for the world to correct itself, then gave a slow, satisfied blink. a nod in another language, the kind that says, finally. I opened the notarization interface, uploaded the digital release. Time-stamped, backed by escrow authority, locked to a single condition. Custodial transfer authorized upon immediate resignation of Vanya Keel from all executive roles, with no reinstatement or advisory retention, verbal or written. There was a beat of silence. The chair glanced at Halstead's legal rep, who nodded once. No debate, no motion to amend. The condition is accepted, the chair said. I hit submit. Access keys restored, API routes reactivated, dashboard latency dropped to 0 across 5 continents in under 12 seconds, and with that, Norellian's heartbeat returned. Not because they fixed anything, but because I allowed it. Later, someone from Halstead would ask for a follow-up call to discuss potential ongoing advisory roles. I told them to put it in writing and send it to my firm, now operating out of its own LLC. I named it Mappin Legacy. Vanya disappeared from the press release that afternoon. No farewell, no LinkedIn post. Just a digital erasure, like a typo someone got tired of excusing. They thought they'd cut dead weight. They thought I was just a leftover from a slower era. But I wasn't legacy, I was escrow.